November 2nd, 1999, started as a typical Tuesday at the Honolulu Xerox office until the meeting turned lethal. 8 o'clock in the morning on the second floor, 7 colleagues settled in to plan their upcoming workday together. 15-year veteran technician Brian Koji Uyasugi walked in, but he wasn't there to work. He was armed with a Glock 17. The nightmare that followed would go down as the most horrific mass slaying in the history of the islands. Uyasugi stepped into the conference room where his boss and 6 others were effectively trapped. He squeezed the trigger with terrifying composure, using hollow-point bullets specifically engineered to inflict the most brutal damage possible. 28 shots rang out as he moved through the small space with calculated, cold-blooded intent. For many of his colleagues, there was nowhere to hide from the gunfire at point-blank range. A lone worker barely dodged death, sprinting away while bullets whistled past him during his desperate escape. Those 7 victims had zero warning and absolutely no way to fight back against the sudden ambush. 58-year-old supervisor Melvin Lee was one of the first targets to fall in the slaughter. 41-year-old Ford Kanehira, Ronald Katoka, 50, Ronald Kawakami, 54, Peter Mark, 46, and John Sakamoto, 36. 33-year-old Christopher Balatico was the final victim in that room, where every life was brutally extinguished. Once the silence returned, the shooter simply walked out, hopped in his van, and sped away from the carnage. Cops cornered him at the Hawaii Nature Center, leading to a tense 5-hour standoff that gripped the entire city. Specialist negotiators spent hours pleading with him to surrender. Finally, he stepped out of his vehicle with his hands up, ending the crisis without another bullet fired. What could possibly snap inside a man to make him hunt his own colleagues? Detectives uncovered a toxic blend of office bitterness and severe paranoia. He was convinced his colleagues were plotting his downfall. In his twisted reality, his coworkers were secretly ruining his equipment to make him look like a failure. The company was shifting to new color copier tech, forcing longtime employees to master complex new systems. Uyasugi hated the change and convinced himself that his refusal to learn made him a marked man. Shrinks later described a mind shattered by delusions, where every shadow felt like a threat. He was dead certain that the office was buzzing with malicious gossip designed to destroy his reputation. He hallucinated that they were breaking the very machines he fixed just to set him up for a fall. These toxic thoughts rotted his brain for years until he felt like a soldier behind enemy lines at work. Though doctors suspected schizophrenia, the red flags had been waving for a long time before the massacre. He'd exploded before, once violently kicking in an elevator door in a fit of uncontrollable rage. He hadn't been shy about his burning hatred for the people he shared an office with. Yet, nobody stopped him until it was too late, leading to a high-stakes legal battle for his life. He stood accused of first-degree murder. Hawaii law lumped the mass killing into one count, while adding attempted murder for the man who escaped. By May 2000, his lawyers were fighting to prove he was too insane to be held responsible. They dragged his long history of mental illness and terrifying hallucinations into the light of the courtroom. 3 different mental health experts were brought in to peel back the layers of his broken psyche. All 3 specialists agreed. The man was suffering from profound and dangerous psychological disorders. They argued he couldn't even grasp that what he did was evil when he pulled that trigger. The defense insisted his warped reality had completely blinded him to the gravity of his crimes. But the state's attorneys weren't buying it, painting a much more sinister picture of the gunman. They pointed out how he chose his gun, picked his targets, and walked straight to that specific room. His slow, rhythmic firing proved he wasn't confused. He was a cold, calculating killer on a mission. It took the jury less than 90 minutes on June 13, 2000 to reach a final decision. They threw out the insanity plea and branded him a murderer on every single count. Mental illness or not, the law decided he knew exactly what he was doing during that bloodbath. August 8, 2000, marked the day Uyasugi was buried alive in the legal system forever. This heavy sentence mirrored the absolute horror of his crimes. A single blood-soaked dawn left 7 dead and a neighborhood shattered. Lawyers fought back, blaming technicalities and a fractured mind for the slaughter. By 2002, Hawaii's highest court slammed the door shut on his freedom. No mistakes were found. The monster would stay caged exactly where he belonged. His world shrunk to the 4 walls of a concrete cell until death. Shrinks dug into his head, trying to find the spark that lit the fuse. He confessed to Dr. Michael Wellner that he wanted to justify their desire to fire him. His twisted logic painted him as a victim fighting back against imaginary ghosts. While the shadows were only in his head, coworkers saw a man simmering with silent rage. People smelled the smoke of his anger, but never imagined the inferno. That chilling gap between a mean glare and mass murder changed workplace safety forever. Now he rots in an Arizona desert facility because Hawaii ran out of room. This remains the ultimate dark scar on the history of the island. It forced a hard look at how we handle office threats. It sparked a desperate need for better mental health checks before the next explosion. For over 20 years, the victim's kin have carried the heavy weight of that morning. 7 souls clocked in for work and punched out into eternity. The shockwaves rattled every citizen, proving nowhere is truly safe from the unthinkable. Decades later, the same nightmare clawed its way into a Virginia store. Just before 10:15 on November 22, 2022, the Chesapeake Walmart became a killing floor. The night crew gathered for a routine huddle, oblivious to the predator among them. Their own supervisor, 31-year-old Andre Marcus Bing, walked in gripped by a 9mm. Sudden gunfire shattered the silence. That very morning, he had legally bought his tool of death. Despite the checks, Virginia's laws allowed him to walk out with a gun in hours. He showed up for work with a loaded magazine and a heart of ice. As the meeting started, the break room turned into a slaughterhouse, claiming 6 lives. 4 more colleagues were left bleeding. This was no random outburst. He had a hit list of specific names. It was a cold, calculated execution of those he despised. Then he ended his own life as sirens raced toward the massacre. Responders found him cold on the floor, surrounded by the coworkers he executed. Forensics picked through the wreckage, hunting for clues in a room of spent shells. A place meant for coffee and laughter was now a catalog of horror. The hunt for a motive led straight into the killer's digital diary. A haunting death note sat on his phone, a final testament to his unraveling. The text was a bitter cocktail of hollow regrets and venomous finger-pointing. He felt the sting of every perceived sneer and office joke. He mocked their intelligence, claiming the devil pulled his strings. What fueled such poisonous hatred? In his head, every hallway whisper was a joke at his expense. Paranoia spiked as he claimed his phone was bugged, slipping further into delusion. This lethal mix of victimhood and madness turned a workplace into a war zone. Survivors remember a man who was always on edge, radiating a strange, prickly fear. He wasn't the type to chat or form bonds with the people around him. He kept to himself, staying far away from the team he supposedly led. He was a difficult coworker, but nobody saw this extreme violence coming. Months before the horror, Bing asked about active shooter drills. That question was a major warning sign he was plotting. Yet it didn't spark the reaction needed to stop the looming disaster. They noticed it, but didn't do anything to stop the inevitable. Police raided Bing's place, finding piles of bullets and personal journals. The notes offered a glimpse into his dark mindset leading up to the attack. He'd been plotting, hoarding gear, and stewing over old grudges. The forensics showed a man who'd been building toward this moment for months. Since Bing ended his own life there, no jury would ever hear his case. Detectives had to rely on cold evidence and the voices of terrified survivors. The final message on his phone helped explain his motives, though many dark secrets remain. Grieving families sued Walmart, claiming the company's neglect led to the carnage. The lawsuit alleged that management ignored every warning sign about Bing. Workers had complained about his scary behavior and the way he acted. Lawyers argued that Walmart failed to protect its staff from a danger they should have spotted. Eventually, Walmart paid out millions to settle with the victims' families. No guilt was admitted in the deal. But the money helped families drowning in grief and the trauma of that night. For the bereaved, money can't replace the dead, but it proved the company handled Bing's behavior poorly. Survivors recalled the absolute terror as a normal workplace turned into a bloody nightmare. Colleagues were gunned down right in front of them while others hid in fear. The unlucky ones died, and the survivors are now scarred by deep mental trauma. The lives lost were Lorenzo Gamble, Brian Pendleton, and Kelly Pyle. Randall Blevins, Tenna Johnson, and 16-year-old Fernando Chavez Barron, whose name was eventually made public. They all clocked in that night expecting a totally normal shift. Families waited for them to come home, but not a single one returned. By 2026, the town is still healing while that store stays open. For many locals, the building is just a grim reminder of the tragedy. Debates over worker safety and corporate blame still rage because of this case. The cycle of workplace grudges turning deadly is a familiar horror story. Michael McDermott. Back in 2000, a Massachusetts tech firm called Edgewater was full of employees. Michael Morgan McDermott tested software there, a job that kept him isolated and focused. On December 26, 2000, the day after Christmas, McDermott went armed and killed 7 people in the office. Born Michael McDermott Martinez in 1958, he grew up in Plymouth. He was raised in a typical working-class family nearby. His early life is mysterious, but his mind started fracturing when he was young. He fought depression and hallucinations that led to extreme panic and strange mental blackouts. He joined the Navy but got kicked out after a mental health breakdown. His military career ended quickly because his mental demons made it impossible to serve. After the Navy, he drifted through jobs until landing at Edgewater Technology. His technical talent was undeniable, yet a mountain of debt began to swallow him whole. Facing $5,600 in unpaid taxes, the government began seizing his earnings directly. Each paycheck arrived smaller than the last, drained by mandatory deductions for his mounting debt. For a man on the financial edge, this was a breaking point. How did money troubles spark such a massacre? 24 hours before the horror, he began sneaking an arsenal into his workplace. He brought the gear in piece by piece, stashing it in hidden corners of the office. With cold, robotic precision, he spent his final hours mapping out the coming slaughter. On December 26th, he targeted the payroll and accounting staff, those he blamed for his empty pockets. That morning, the office was shattered by 37 rounds of gunfire. He stalked through the cubicles, executing 7 coworkers right at their desks. The victims were simply regular people starting their workday, processing files and balancing ledgers, unaware they were marked for death by a vengeful colleague. Once the barrel went cold, he didn't try to run or hide. He gave up with an eerie, hollow stillness as the police moved in to arrest him. He seemed completely detached, as if he'd just finished a chore rather than a mass killing. This terrifying lack of emotion would later define the battle over his sanity. During questioning, he spun a twisted tale of a mission to terminate targets without harming bystanders, claiming his coworkers were actually ghosts from a dark chapter of history. He believed he had time traveled to assassinate Hitler and his inner circle of generals. This was a total break from reality, a delusional fantasy where murder was seen as a heroic act. However, a digital trail on his computer told a much more calculated story. He had been scouring the internet for tips on how to mimic madness and dodge prison. This research pointed to cold calculation rather than a sudden mental snap, proving he was planning his legal escape before the first shot was ever fired. The trial finally opened in 2002. His legal team fought to prove he was legally insane during the attack. They presented a grim history of mental decay and a diagnosis of schizophrenia. They used his talk of Nazis and time travel as evidence of a fractured mind. Various medical specialists testified that his psychological state was profoundly broken. They insisted his delusions were a terrifying reality for him, not a performance. But the state argued that despite his illness, he knew exactly what he was doing. Those digital searches about faking it proved he understood the gravity of his crimes. His methodical planning sealed his fate. The jury rejected the insanity plea and found him guilty. They ruled that while his mind was sick, he still carried the weight of his actions. The verdict meant he was headed for a prison cell, not a hospital wing. He received 7 life sentences without parole, 1 for every heartbeat he stopped forever. Grieving families filled the courtroom to share the agony of their sudden loss. They spoke of loved ones who went to work after Christmas and simply never returned. Craig Wood, Cheryl Troy, Jennifer Bragg Capobiano, Louis Javelve, and Janice Haggerty, along with Rosamund Freddy and Paul Marrow, were remembered as more than just headlines, but as real people with dreams and families whose entire futures were stolen in a single violent morning. He tried to appeal the conviction, claiming the trial was unfair, but the courts didn't blink. Judges ruled that despite his mental struggles, the evidence of his criminal intent was undeniable. As of 2026, now 68, McDermott rots in a Massachusetts dungeon, serving 7 life terms without any hope of release. The mail system had already tasted blood years prior. Edmond, Oklahoma, August 20th, 1986. Patrick Sherrill punched in for his final morning shift. For 16 months, this quiet letter carrier had been a ghost within the Federal Postal Service. That dawn, his bag carried firepower intended for the very supervisors and peers he served with. When the smoke cleared, 14 souls were gone, and Sherrill lay dead by his own cold hand. His story began November 13th, 1941, in the town of Watonga, Oklahoma. A lonely youth, locals dubbed him Crazy Pat for his hair-trigger temper and dark fascination with weaponry. He walked through life alone, a bizarre figure unable to connect with the world around him. This unsettling aura and social dysfunction became his permanent shadow. Though he wore a Marine uniform, he never saw any foreign battlefield. Within the Oklahoma Air National Guard, he transformed into a terrifyingly precise sharpshooter. He took chilling pride in his lethality, mastering the art of the perfect shot. Military life failed his soul. Afterward, he drifted through a string of dead-end jobs and failed attempts. His jagged personality made keeping a job or a friend an impossible task. By 1985, the post office felt like a sanctuary for a lonely man. It was a world of rigid routine, a perfect hideout for a man who hated people. Yet, even there, Sherrill's inner demons began to bleed through. He faltered on his roots, unable to keep pace with the ticking clock. As supervisors criticized him, his paranoia grew. He felt like a hunted man. The breaking point was a harsh formal warning that shattered his thin composure yesterday. This single piece of paper acted like a lit fuse on a powder keg. Sunrise on August 20th saw him walking into work, packing 2 loaded Colt .45 automatics. He stepped inside at 6:30 a.m., just as the building hummed with the morning shift. His first bullets found his supervisors, before he turned his rage on everyone in sight. The slaughter lasted 15 minutes. He stalked the aisles, gunning down victims as they sorted the morning's mail. Others were cornered and executed, while desperately seeking cover. A workplace morphed into a slaughterhouse, leaving 14 workers dead in the wake of his fury. 6 others survived the massacre, ranging in age and experience. Seasoned veterans and fresh faces alike were swept up in his sudden whirlwind of pure hate. They just wanted to work. Why didn't anyone see the monster in the next aisle? Sirens wailed as police arrived, but the thunder of gunfire had already ceased. They found Sherrill's corpse. He had blown his own brains out after erasing 14 innocent lives. The carnage greeting the first responders was a nightmare. Corpses everywhere, hollow-eyed survivors, and the realization that one man had dismantled a world in minutes. Because the killer died, there would be no justice, no trial, and no answers from the man who did it. Investigators were left to scavenge through blood and history to find a why for this. That final reprimand might have sparked the fire, but decades of simmering rage and isolation had already soaked the building in gasoline. Survivors recalled a man who was a walking storm cloud, always angry and always alone. They felt his hostility, but never dreamed he would unleash a massacre of this magnitude. The terrifying bridge between a weird coworker and a killer remains a chilling lesson for us all. The blood-soaked legacy of Edmond completely redefined how we view violence on the clock. This birthed a terrifying new idiom that haunted the American psyche. A morbidly ironic label sparked by a wave of mailroom massacres. Reeling from Edmond, the postal brass scrambled to overhaul their security protocols. Everyone wondered if the red flags were ignored until it was far too late. But history was destined to repeat its darkest chapter through another disgruntled soul. November 14th, 1991, transformed a Michigan sorting center into a killing floor. Thomas McIlvaine, a man stripped of his badge and his livelihood, reached his breaking point. He crept back into the facility, his hands gripped tight around a semi-automatic Ruger. Within moments, 4 lay dead and 5 were wounded before he turned the gun on himself. He was 34. A Detroit native, he had once looked to the mail service for a stable future. Instead, his tenure became a toxic spiral of write-ups and explosive confrontations. Though axed in 1989 for defiance, he clawed his way back through a bitter legal fight. Getting his job back didn't extinguish the fire burning inside him. The friction only intensified as McIlvaine racked up more black marks on his record. By 1990, he was terminated again after a chilling confrontation with a boss. He refused to go quietly, dragging the post office through a grueling arbitration battle. This time, the ruling was final. His career was buried for good. Rage replaced shock as he openly whispered about the blood he planned to spill. He obsessed over the people he believed had ruined his life. Despite terrified coworkers sounding the alarm, the bureaucracy remained frozen in place. The predator was identified, yet the cage doors were left wide open. That cold November afternoon, McIlvaine set his final plan in motion at Royal Oak. He walked in during the lunch rush, a high-powered rifle hidden in his shadow. He stalked the halls, hunting the specific bosses who had ended his career. He found his mark in Christopher Carlyle, the man who had led his disciplinary hearings. At point-blank range, he delivered a lethal message of vengeance. He moved through the building, selecting his victims with terrifying precision. A calculated massacre, fueled by pure spite, left 4 workers lifeless on the tile. Among the fallen was Supervisor Christopher Carlyle. Alongside him were Mary Benincasa, Keith Clow, and Rosemary Fumara, all caught in the crossfire. 5 other people suffered wounds, several of them fighting for their very lives. Every victim was just an ordinary employee trying to finish their shift. Authorities discovered his lifeless body, the result of a self-inflicted shot. Just like the Edmund shooter, he took his secrets and his madness to the grave. Investigators had to piece together the slaughter from his trail of threats and broken history. Records later confirmed that he had voiced chilling, specific threats. He had boasted to anyone who would listen that he would get his pound of flesh. Management had the warnings in writing, filed away while the clock was ticking. The safety net snapped, allowing a known wolf back into the fold to kill. Only 5 years had passed since the last bloodbath in Oklahoma. A sinister trend was emerging, and it was written in blood. Desperate men with grudges were turning their old workplaces into shooting galleries. The pressure on the Postal Service to stop the bleeding became an absolute roar. The term "going postal" took root, reflecting a public fear of the growing violence inside the mail service. Families dragged the Postal Service into court, claiming they turned a blind eye to a looming shadow. The legal battle exposed how warnings about Mullivan's malice were ignored by those in charge. The trial shed light on deep-rooted institutional decay regarding volatile staff and their vows of bloody retribution. 4 innocent souls perished while simply performing their daily postal grind. They were sorting letters and managing desks, unaware of the impending doom. Their blood wasn't shed for their mistakes, but for a safety net that simply shredded. Pennsylvania soon became the backdrop for another horrifying industrial nightmare. January 17, 2005, saw David Dong return to the Great Lakes Foundry. This 57-year-old had been cast out following a bitter clash with his superiors. Packing a 12-gauge shotgun, he snuffed out 3 lives before ending his own. Dong had been a fixture at that foundry for 15 long years. The work was grueling, involving molten steel and heavy, dangerous machinery. He was a veteran of the floor, intimately familiar with every corner and coworker. Yet, his tenure ended in a storm of fury that remains shrouded in mystery. We only know a heated confrontation with management sealed his fate. Hostility boiled over until the company finally severed their ties with him. To Dong, being discarded like scrap metal was an unforgivable insult. Rather than walking away, he walked back in that morning with a 12-gauge. He hunted down the bosses, turning the workplace into a shooting gallery. Within those cramped industrial walls, the shotgun blasts sounded like thunder. 3 men stood in his path and were instantly cut down. The fallen were managers James Pelletio, Michael Ruff, and Donald Neiman, all leaders there. He picked them out because they wore the badge of authority, likely seeing them as the architects of his professional ruin. It was a calculated strike against the men he blamed for his downfall. With the bosses dead, Dong pointed the barrel at himself and pulled. Authorities arrived to a grisly scene of 4 lifeless bodies on the cold floor. The massacre was brief, but the psychological scars would never truly heal. Since the killer took his secrets to the grave, no courtroom would ever hear him. Detectives were forced to piece together his past like a broken mirror, tracing his final days, and firing to unearth a motive for the carnage. This surgical strike on management screamed of a man seeking a final, bloody accounting. Those who survived the horror were left paralyzed by a sense of pure shock. A foundry is for building things, not a place where life is torn apart. Amidst the heat and heavy iron, no one expected a former friend to bring war. 3 families were shattered that day, left to mourn a sudden, violent void. They kissed their loved ones goodbye, never suspecting a death sentence awaited at the clock. To the managers, firing him was business. To him, it was a declaration of war. Illinois would soon mirror this horror at another massive engine factory. Enter William Baker at the Navistar plant in Melrose Park. On February 5th, 2001, a ghost from the past walked in. At 66, Baker had recently been kicked out of the diesel engine facility. Armed to the teeth, he slaughtered 4 people after 39 years of service. 4 decades of labor gave him a terrifying knowledge of his targets. He possessed an intimate knowledge of the hallways, the staff, and the daily grind. Yet decades of loyalty offered no shield when the board decided his time was up. Booted in 1994 for trailer theft, a deep resentment quietly rotted within him for years. What fueled Baker's patient, 7-year quest for blood, this massive gap between his firing and the 2001 massacre, remains chillingly rare. Usually, workplace violence erupts almost immediately following the initial spark. A termination, a write-up, or some perceived betrayal. But Baker's long wait suggests a slow-burning rage, or a sudden, mysterious breaking point in early 2001. On February 5th, Baker returned to the factory floor, armed with 3 different firearms. He stalked the familiar layout, hunting victims in the very rooms where he'd spent half his life. Armed to the teeth, he held the terrifying power to inflict absolute carnage. And he turned that lethal force against his former colleagues and managers. By the time the shooting stopped, 4 lives had been snuffed out. Robert Verheim, Daniel Dorsch, Thomas Kreppel, and Martin Rittman were simply working when death walked in. Among the fallen were a supervisor and 3 coworkers who never saw it coming. His rampage seemed chaotic, as he fired upon anyone in sight rather than hunting specific targets. With the bloodbath complete, the gunman turned the muzzle on himself. Authorities discovered his corpse amidst his own weapons, the victim of a final, desperate act. Forensic teams meticulously combed the site, desperate to understand why a 7-year-old grudge suddenly turned lethal. Evidence soon proved this wasn't a snap decision. It was a cold, calculated plot. Bit by bit, he had legally built his personal armory in the shadows. He dropped chilling hints to others about his burning resentment over being discarded by the firm. Yet his preparations remained invisible, never once triggering an alarm until it was far too late. That 7-year silence left investigators baffled about what finally snapped his restraint. Did some fresh insult reopen the old wounds of his termination? Or was he drowning in debt and looking for a corporate scapegoat to punish? Those secrets went to the grave, leaving only grim theories about his eventual breaking point. This tragedy proved that a former employee's shadow can haunt a company for nearly a decade. Security teams are typically built to spot immediate dangers, the fires burning right now. They watch the newly dismissed or the openly aggressive, overlooking the ghosts of the past. Since Baker was gone for 7 years, he was a forgotten man until he became a nightmare. If these dark accounts fascinate you, join our community by subscribing and ringing that notification bell. This terrifying cycle repeated itself, this time involving a postal worker in the Golden State. Her name was Jennifer San Marco. On January 30th, 2006, a shadow returned to a Goleta mail processing center. 44-year-old San Marco was forced out of the service in 2003, following a mental breakdown. 3 years of silence ended when she stepped back onto the property with a 9mm handgun. By dawn, 7 lay dead, including a neighbor and San Marco herself, leaving 6 bodies at the plant. Her career with the mail service didn't just end. It collapsed in a storm of controversy. Her bizarre antics and unsettling outbursts had long since terrified those working the same shift. Management kept a grim paper trail of her fracturing sanity. They eventually forced her onto medical leave, a move that permanently severed her ties to the job. Once she walked out those doors, she never punched the clock again. During those 3 years of isolation, her mind evidently slipped into total darkness. Relocating to New Mexico, she became known to locals as a volatile and suspicious recluse. She was convinced she was being watched, haunted by shadows, and imaginary plots that slowly choked out her reality, leaving her utterly alone in a twisted mental prison. On the night of January 30th, just before the sorting center bloodbath, San Marco crept toward a quiet Santa Barbara residence. Beverly Graham, in her mid-50s, had no idea who was standing on the other side of her door. San Marco unleashed a hail of bullets, executing her right there in the entrance of her own home. This first kill was an opening act of vengeance, fueled by the poisonous lies swirling in the shooter's head. Leaving the first body behind, she raced toward the Guyetta mail facility, her former place of employment. She slipped inside around 7 that evening while the night crew worked, stalking the halls with a 9mm pistol looking for targets. By the time the shooting stopped, 6 Postal employees lay dead on the cold floor. The fallen were Charlotte Colton, 54, Nicola Grant, 42, Malika Higgins, 28, and James Shannon, 57. 44-year-old Z. Magsy and 37-year-old Richard Lanes also perished. Fate alone spared Guadalupe Schwartz from the night's horrific carnage. Each was gunned down mid-task, clutching letters and parcels they would never finish processing. After slaughtering 5 coworkers, San Marco retreated into a bathroom and turned the weapon on herself. Police burst into the facility to find her lifeless body slumped near the smoking handgun. The building was a tomb of chaos, with terrified survivors huddled in dark corners or fleeing for their lives. While medics fought to save the bleeding, detectives began the grim task of piecing together the massacre. Investigators quickly unmasked the killer, uncovering her long, dark history with the mail service. Her old personnel files detailed a disturbing mental collapse that had previously forced her out of work. Former peers recalled a volatile, deeply unsettling woman whose behavior had been a ticking time bomb long before she left. Why return after 3 years? The answer lay in the total disintegration of her sanity. Her personal journals were a map of madness, filled with deranged conspiracies about her colleagues in the post office. She felt like a persecuted victim, convinced that everyone was plotting her downfall, and that she needed to eliminate her imaginary enemies. Her reasons were a nonsensical blur, seen only through the cracked lens of her psychosis. Out in New Mexico, neighbors remembered her as a haunting and bizarre presence. She'd cover her door in frantic, handwritten rants, screaming accusations at anyone and everyone in the outside world. She was obsessed with the idea that invisible forces were tracking her every move. She existed in a nightmare realm where she couldn't tell the difference between a real person and a threat. The Gallaudet tragedy hit 20 years after Edmund and 16 years after the blood at Royal Oak. By then, the phrase, "going postal," had already been carved into the American consciousness. Yet again, a mundane mailroom had been transformed into a house of horrors. The slaughter forced the agency to face hard truths about mental health and the security gaps that let killers back inside. 6 innocent souls, including Beverly Graham, left behind families, now haunted by a tragedy they can't fathom. Graham's only mistake was being home and answering her door. The others were just doing their jobs, completely unaware of the lethal grudge coming for them. They were simply the targets of a broken mind that had finally snapped. For the people of Guyetta and postal workers everywhere, the event was a chilling reminder of how easily peace can be shattered. Cameras and guards offer little protection against a person who no longer cares if they live or die. The terrifying randomness of who was spared that night underscores the cruel, senseless nature of the whole ordeal. Since San Marco chose to end her own life, there was no day in court, no chance for the law to hold her accountable for the blood she spilled. The case was closed by blaming her psychosis, a verdict of madness, rather than a criminal conviction. It was a conclusion built on cold forensic evidence instead of a confession. Mail authorities scrambled to overhaul their approach to handling unstable employees. Whispers grew could the system have flagged her before she breached the facility gates. San Marco was madness personified, but the next horror was fueled by a perceived vendetta. Omar Thornton, a quiet beer hub in Manchester, Connecticut. August 3rd, 2010, a date for the graveyard. At 34, Thornton was busted siphoning inventory from the very floor he walked. The lens didn't lie, capturing him stashing stolen goods into his personal ride without permission. The bosses cornered him, offering a graceful exit instead of a shameful firing. Hartford Distributors was a tight-knit beverage wholesaler with about 50 souls on the payroll. For 2 long years, he'd been their man on the road, hauling crates across the territory. Grainy tapes revealed a pattern he'd been bleeding the company dry on multiple occasions. Faced with the cold proof, he quietly signed his own professional death warrant. But as he turned to leave, he reached into a lunch bag not for a meal, but for 2 9mm irons. He'd brought the heat that morning. This wasn't a snap. It was a cold-blooded plan. The meeting ended, but Thornton stayed. Then, the lethal lead started flying. 8 men fell in that cold warehouse. Names like Brian Sirigliano, 51, just a driver. Craig Pepin, 60. Victor James, 60. Edwin Kennesinson, 54. Leif Felder, 50. Douglas Scruton, 56. Francis Fazio Jr., 57. William Ehrman, 51. Most were his own Union brothers. 2 others barely escaped the Reaper's reach. He prowled the aisles like a shadow, hunting anyone unlucky enough to be in his path. Panic erupted. Workers dove for cover, clawing for any exit as the air turned toxic. Some found the door, others found only the business end of his barrel. With the law closing in, he made one final call to his mother, claiming his hand was forced by hate. He ranted about a campaign of relentless harassment against him. He spoke of vile slurs on bathroom walls and a system rigged against his skin. He blamed his descent on the venom of others, his final words the only testimony to his rage. No notes, no manifesto, just the hollow echoes of a phone call. His partner later recalled his bitter tales of bias, though she'd never seen the proof herself. She mentioned digital snapshots, alleged proof of the slurs he said were etched into the company walls. But the brass and the crew told a different story, one where the hate didn't exist. Union reps stood firm. Thornton had never once whispered a word of grievance to them. The system for reporting bias was active, yet his file was eerily silent. The guys on the floor never saw it. No slurs, no sneers, just a guy doing his job without a single complaint. Investigators dug deep, but found nothing to back his claims of a racial war. The only hard truth was the video of him stealing the real reason for that final confrontation. Was he a victim of a phantom bias, or just a thief crafting a final desperate lie? The only certainty? He brought tools of death to settle a score with men who were his brothers. Once the line to his mother went dead, Thornton took his own exit before the sirens reached the door. Cops stumbled upon his remains in an office, flanked by the twin engines of his carnage. 8 blue-collar lives, snuffed out men who spent their days serving the city's bars and bistros. They had homes, they had kids. They had lives that weren't supposed to end on a warehouse floor. They clocked in for a normal shift, never dreaming a brother in arms would become their executioner. Some were in that tense meeting. Others were just wrong place, wrong time casualties. For the survivors, his claims of bias were a final, twisted insult to their agonizing grief. Officials flatly denied that any alleged bias could ever justify such a massacre. Even if his claims were real, police found zero evidence to support them. Slaughtering coworkers was never a sane or valid way to settle a score. Families swore the victims played no part in any alleged prejudice he felt. The tragedy sparked debates on how companies handle internal strife and bias complaints. Had he truly been bullied, better paths existed to solve the issue. Legitimate union channels and internal grievance rules were available to help him. Bypassing those steps implies the hate didn't exist, or he simply preferred violence. Union reps for the firm insisted their contracts strictly forbid any workplace discrimination. They had a solid record of fixing issues whenever they were reported. His total silence suggested he never even tried to resolve the problem legally. Since the killer ended himself, a trial will never reveal the dark facts. His accusations remained unproven cries made during a final, frantic phone call. Minnesota would soon face a similar horror at a local signage company. Andrew Engeldinger brought terror to accent signage in the city of Minneapolis. On September 27, 2012, he was officially fired from his job. 36-year-old Andrew Engeldinger had been a production worker for the firm. A history of poor work led supervisors to end his employment that day. Summoned to the firing that afternoon, he chose to act with immediate violence. Accent Signage was a small shop building custom commercial displays for clients. Around 25 souls worked in the shop, designing and installing various signs. He had worked there for several years before the trouble began, yet his performance tanked so badly that bosses had no choice but termination. Upon hearing the news, he left the room and went to his locker. He grabbed a Glock 9mm he'd smuggled in that very morning. Whether he planned this or just always carried a gun remains a mystery. Armed and ready, he marched back to the scene of the meeting. He opened fire, executing the owner and the manager who fired him. Founder Reuven Rahamaim was hit first and died right on the spot. Operations manager Keith Baczynski was also gunned down in the same room. The killer then stalked the facility. 4 others died on site and 1 in surgery, including Benke, Edberg, Cooks, and driver Eric Rivers. Dion Powell survived the attack despite being shot during the chaos. UPS driver Eric Rivers didn't even work at the signage company. He was just making a routine delivery when the shooting started. Being there at that moment made him a victim of tragic chance. He died just for doing his job at a place he barely knew. 4 other people sustained serious injuries during the assault. Workers fled or hid in closets, praying the gunman would not find them. A normal workplace turned into a bloody scene of terror in mere minutes. Police swarmed the building after receiving frantic emergency calls from inside. As officers moved in, a final shot echoed from the dark stairwell. They found him dead beside his weapon, ending a truly devastating morning. 7 corpses and traumatized survivors were left in the wake of the violence. Looking into his past revealed a man who was deeply disturbed. Years of dark psychological instability trailed him like a shadow. He was a drifter in life, unable to anchor himself to a career or a companion. His output at the firm had rotted, a slow-motion collapse that made his firing inevitable. Yet nothing in his paper trail hinted at the blood-soaked storm he was brewing. He never growled at his peers or spat venom at the board. No red flags ever tripped the wires of the company's security net. Packing iron on his final day suggested a cold, calculated hunger for carnage. To those who shared his space, he was nothing more than a ghost. He was a silent phantom, obsessing over tasks that were rapidly falling apart. A heavy shroud of misery seemed to hang over his every move. But thousands faced the daily grind without letting the inner beast take control. Reuven Rahamaim had birthed this empire from nothing, turning a dream into a titan. He was the iron pillar of the local trade world, a man of pure integrity. His sudden, violent exit left the heart of the company cold and beatingless. The other souls lost were masters of their craft or just unlucky messengers. For 7 families, the void was made deeper by the sheer, senseless horror. They had to swallow the nightmare. Their world ended over a pink slip. The math of his madness lives for a paycheck died with him that afternoon. There would be no justice in court, only a cold corpse and unanswered screams. Detectives were left to sift through paper scraps and the echoes of the dead. The facts were etched in blood, but the motive remained locked in a dead man's skull. That same rhythmic terror would soon find a new home in Maryland. A new name for the annals of fear: Snokia Mosley at the Aberdeen hub. On September 20th, 2018, a temp worker arrived with a hidden malice. At 26, Mosley wasn't just clocking in. She was packing a 9mm Glock. Before the smoke cleared, 3 colleagues were gone and Mosley had joined them. The massive distribution hive was home to hundreds of bustling workers. It was a sea of faces, mixing long-term staff with transient souls. Tons of cargo and medicine flowed through those gates to the world outside. The air was thick with the heavy rhythm of sorting and loading shipments. For months, Mosley was just another cog in the vast warehouse machine. Her past was a graveyard of short stints, never staying long enough to root. Those who worked beside her saw only a quiet, unreachable wallflower. She existed in a self-imposed exile, a silent observer of the daily grind. At 9 in the morning, the warehouse hum was shattered by the sound of lead. The loading docks became a stage for a sudden, horrific nightmare. She stalked the concrete floor, targeting the very people she once knew. In that sudden flash of violence, 3 precious lives were snuffed out. Sunday, Shoran, 53. Victoria Palacio, 28. Helene Reyes, 41. All lost. While some names were confused, the darkness that day belonged solely to Snokia. 3 others carried away the scars of an encounter with their former peer. Survivors spoke of a descent into pure, unadulterated hell as the lead flew. Desperate souls dove behind heavy pallets or bolted for the light of the exits. The facility was a sprawling maze, yet it offered no sanctuary from the storm. On the wide-open docks, there was simply nowhere to hide from the carnage. Sirens wailed as police swarmed the scene just moments after the first frantic alarm. As the tactical team moved to breach the building, the sharp crack of more gunfire echoed. They found Mosley's cold body inside. She'd taken the coward's way out before they could catch her. Her weapon lay nearby, leaving her dark, twisted motives buried in the silence. She left no note and no final statement to explain the sudden carnage. There was no manifesto for the world to decipher. No social media rants existed to reveal why she turned a workplace into a killing floor. Detectives tore through her life, desperate to find one scrap of a reason for the bloodbath. They uncovered a portrait of a woman drowning in a cycle of failed jobs and broken hearts. She was a ghost in the workforce, drifting aimlessly from one paycheck to the next. Real human connection seemed to slip through her fingers like cold sand. Yet none of those common struggles justified the massacre of her innocent coworkers. Hazy rumors of office friction surfaced, but they were nothing more than unconfirmed whispers. Some suggested she harbored a secret, burning grudge over being disrespected, but these were just petty workplace gripes, never something that should have turned lethal. Absolutely nothing signaled that she was a ticking time bomb waiting to detonate. Her status as a temporary hire made her a cipher, nearly impossible for investigators to track. Disposable workers often haunt the edges of a company, never truly feeling like they belong. They live in the shadow of termination, knowing they are easily replaced and entirely forgotten. That constant instability breeds a biting sense of alienation that can rot the soul. The slaughter raised terrifying questions about how we actually vet our temporary staff. Did anyone actually look into her eyes before handing her a badge to the facility? Was there even a single eye on her once she slipped through those warehouse doors? Shockingly, her killing machine was bought totally legally, clearing every single background check. 3 lives were snuffed out in a heartbeat. Brinley Sheridan, Hayden Bonta, and Snokia Stone were just ordinary people earning a living. They were sorting cargo, the invisible gears that keep the entire world moving. They had no link to Mosley. Their endings were just cruel, random strokes of fate. With Mosley dead, the courtroom stayed silent, and the truth died right along with her. The case is officially closed, but the haunting why still hangs heavy in the air. What was the specific spark that ignited her rage on that fateful morning? Was this a cold, calculated plan or a sudden explosive burst of madness? The Aberdeen community and the warehouse crew remained shattered by the horror. Nobody expects a quiet distribution hub to be transformed into a slaughterhouse. Tragedy would soon return to the manufacturing floor through a man named Gary Martin. Inside Henry Pratt on February 15, 2019, a routine meeting turned deadly. 45-year-old Gary Martin was a simple assembler on the factory production line. After 15 years of loyalty, he was being thrown out into the cold. A background check lie finally surfaced, and he answered the news with a Smith & Wesson. He pulled a .40 caliber pistol, equipped with a lethal laser sight, from his hiding place. The Henry Pratt plant was the backbone of Aurora, employing 200 souls near Chicago. For decades, it had been a sanctuary of stable, quiet manufacturing work for the community. Martin had been a fixture there since 2004, building industrial valves. His world crumbled when they discovered he had lied on a gun application years ago. It was a dark secret that proved he should never have been armed in the first place. During the firing meeting, Martin whipped out a pistol and started spraying lead at everyone present. He executed the messengers first, before hunting down more victims throughout the shop floor. The workplace was buzzing with staff when the terrifying violence suddenly broke out. 5 souls perished that bloody afternoon. Manager Josh Pinkard, 37, HR's Clayton Parks, 32, and warehouseman Vicente Juarez, 54, operator Russell Bayer, 47, and intern Trevor Weiner, 21, who was just starting out. The fate of young Trevor Weiner is particularly haunting. He arrived for his first day of training, never knowing it would be his last. It was a chilling reminder of how deadly a wrong place, wrong time situation can be. 6 more were wounded, including 5 brave officers who charged directly into the line of fire. Martin ambushed the police as they entered, hitting several before they could drop him. Police returned fire, killing Martin in a gunfight that left multiple officers bleeding. Investigators found shocking proof that Martin was never legally allowed to have that weapon. A 1995 assault conviction in Mississippi should have legally barred him from weapons. He flat out lied on his 2014 Illinois permit application to bypass the security check. He cleared the initial screen and walked out with a Smith & Wesson pistol. A deeper background check for a carry permit later exposed his violent criminal past. State police tried revoking his license, but Martin simply refused to hand over the gun. The system flagged him, yet lacked the power to actually seize the illegal weapon. This massive enforcement failure let Martin keep his pistol for years after the ban. The handgun used at Henry Pratt was a legal purchase he shouldn't have kept. The safety net failed when the initial check missed his previous violent record. And again, when authorities couldn't force him to disarm once they knew. Fellow workers described Martin as a quiet loner who kept to himself. He spent 15 years assembling valves without trouble, maintaining a steady, decades-long career. Whatever darkness triggered his firing seems to have surfaced very recent. The deadly shift was a sharp break from his long history of employment. Bringing a gun to his firing proves he knew his job was ending. Whether he intended to kill or just felt threatened remains a mystery. Once the axe fell, he chose to grab the gun and start shooting everyone present. For the survivors, it is a nightmare knowing the shooter was illegally armed for years. If the system had truly forced him to surrender the pistol when his record surfaced, his victims might still be alive. This systemic breakdown felt like a second, deeper betrayal to the grieving families. The Aurora community banded together for the victims and the wounded lawmen. Vigils and funds emerged as a massive wave of support swept the region. California would soon endure its own terrifying workplace massacre at a transit hub. Samuel Cassidy stalked the San Jose rail yard for the Valley Transportation Authority. An employee arrived for duty on May 26, 2021. 57-year-old Samuel Cassidy worked there as a technician for the fleet. He hauled in an arsenal, butchered 9 colleagues, and then took his own life. The slaughter happened during shift change. He struck when the crowd was thickest to maximize the bloodshed. The VTA rail system was the vital transport lifeline for the San Jose area. In that yard where Cassidy worked, the trains slept while teams handled their nightly overhaul. Scores of staff filled dozens of different roles there. Technicians and office crews kept the massive city veins pulsing. Cassidy spent 20 years there, climbing the ranks as a technician, until he knew every face and every dark corner. Coworkers recognized him, though accounts of his spirit differed. Some saw a difficult man, while others barely noticed his presence. On May 26th, he arrived packed with 3 pistols and mountains of ammunition. He also carried fire starters, using them to torch his own home first. His house ignited just as the first echoes of gunfire erupted. It seemed he wanted to erase his past before ending his future. Inside the yard, he opened fire during a crowded morning union meeting. He stalked through the buildings, hunting down specific coworkers one by one. This was a hit list, not chaos. He spared some while coldly executing others. 9 people perished. Paul Del Rumegia, 42, an assistant leader. Operator Topaj Deepep Singh, 36. Adrian Balaza, 29, a maintenance hand. Electrician Jose de Jesus Hernandez III, 35. Timothy Michael Romo, 49. Michael Joseph Rudametkin, 40. Abdul Vahab Alakmandan, 63, a veteran worker. Lars Kepler Lane, 63. Alex Ward Free, 49, who kept power lines. The fallen included train drivers, equipment fixers, and those who kept the power running. Their ages spanned from 29 to 63, covering several generations. Their only link was their job, and being there when he struck. Local deputies swarmed the scene minutes after the first desperate calls. Navigating the chaos, they found the victims and guided survivors to safety. The massive complex was a maze of steel and shadowed corners. Scouring every room for hidden threats was a long, tense ordeal. They found Cassidy dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He took his own life as the perimeter closed in, tight. 3 weapons sat near his body alongside spent shells and his bloody trail. The probe revealed a man consumed by toxic, long-term personal grudges. Peers described a man who loathed his job and nursed deep-seated anger. Years of unsettling comments had surfaced, though nothing ever triggered an arrest. Notebooks found in his ruins showed he had been planning this massacre. Fire destroyed much, but investigators salvaged enough to prove it was all premeditated. He had calculated every move, every victim, and his final escape. His selective targeting proved this was a calculated vendetta, not random rage. Terrified workers watched him pass them by without firing, while hunting chosen targets. He carried a mental hit list of those he blamed for everything. His secrets died with him, leaving the city in a state of shock. The event was bone-shaking. The agency lost 9 veterans in 1 hour, creating massive emotional scars. These were the experts who kept the city moving. Replacing them is impossible. 9 families suddenly lost their fathers, their husbands, and their primary providers. Candlelight vigils flickered across the city as neighbors gathered to mourn the fallen. That ends our report for today. The horror ends? No. Tap for the next tragedy.